Good afternoon, everyone. This is our last session in the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development Determining Income webinar series. So a couple of us met yesterday, it's good to see you guys back, and those that joined us last week for annual income. We are excited to welcome you back this week. So for the session today, we thought we would go ahead and it's on overall income, policies, procedures, record keeping. We also want to use it as a catch-up opportunity to make sure that we have all of your questions that you have about gross annual income, which has been primarily what we've been focused on with this webinar series. But also yesterday we did adjusted income for tenant-based rental assistance. So we really want to understand what your questions are, and if anything is left over that maybe you've been thinking about since we were last together, we definitely want to get an answer to your question. So I already know there has been at least one question in the Q&A box. So we encourage you to use that throughout this course, that you can ask a question again that's been on your mind. It doesn't have to be specific about our last session together. If you have any technical issues, Chantel has joined us. She will be available in the chat section that you can use to help you get support that way for any technical issues. So I want to go ahead and we should go ahead and start with Mentimeter as we have been, and make sure that we kind of get started with today's presentation. And, you know, I am a big fan of the state of Pennsylvania. Hopefully you've been able to pick that up as we have discussed. You know, yesterday I revealed that I was in utero in the Poconos as a kid, obviously. So that was my time in the Poconos. But I'd like to travel your state, and I really want to know, and maybe you could share with me in Mentimeter today. And don't forget the upper right-hand corner here has the code. I really want to understand what your best kept secret is, so for travelers kind of coming in. So what are you know, maybe it's something that's in your neck of the woods of the state that you really want to make sure, you know, people visit, and we can talk about it. Okay, I love the falling water. I do like, now I'm spacing on his name, Frank Lloyd Wright. I do like his architecture. That was my homage on the front of Mentimeter. That page actually had falling water. I do not know Kentuck Knob, so I'm going to need to know a lot more about that. That would be really helpful. Let me see what else is on here. The Kenzoa Bridge. I really want to know where that one is. Bridges are, you know, some of my favorites. Gravity Hill. Wow, lots that I have never explored. I have not been there. There's a Grand Canyon in Pennsylvania? Wow. Okay, I need to know more about that. Gettysburg is one of my favorite places to visit. Lots of cute little towns around there. Oh, Yuengling does a brewery cave? Is that like a tour? Yuengling has been with me since college as one beverage I've had. I had no idea that you could go into the brewery caves. That sounds awesome. Okay. All right, what else are we seeing here? Historic Summit Inn, lots of great places. Okay. All right, well, any place that I mentioned or I didn't call out, you know, let us know why that's your favorite place, maybe in the chat area. It'd be kind of fun. A bunch of people said this Kinzua Bridge. I need to look this up. I'm gonna have to find out where this bridge is. Okay, all right, thank you so much. Lots to add to my list, and for others, hopefully to add to their list as well. I also thought before we get started, again, today is about procedures and your policies, things like that. I really want to know if you think income determination is in documents. And so I really want to make sure that, you know, you kind of grade yourself as we get started today. Do you think your policies and procedures Do you think if you happen to have a written agreement with the subrecipient, do you cover your definition of income? Do you cover what forms you require? Do you have templates that you have used in your program? Just tell me a little bit more about how you've been able to document your income eligibility process and things like that. And we'll kind of, think through this feedback as we move forward. So overwhelming you get gold stars. Overwhelming you're like, of course, and you consider yourself #rock star. But then some of you, maybe like, maybe you're not 100% sure, but you want to go back and, maybe take a look. That might be the 7 of you so far. And definitely, hopefully, you see that this is something that's incredibly important to DCED and also to HUD. And, it's something that's pretty important to both the CDBG program and to home. So, so go ahead and grade yourself. I'm going to leave this open as I move back to the PowerPoints, but it's really helpful for you to kind of tell us where you think you are as we get started. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and start some of the material, and then we'll take a break, see what's in the questions box, things like that. So, so in terms of what you need to have, so you must have income eligibility policies and procedures, and you need to have it for, the various activities that you're doing. So we mentioned that as part of this course, you may have a DCED funded homebuyer program, or you may have a DCED funded owner-occupied rehabilitation, or we also talked about some economic development type assistance. So you're really going to need to document that based upon the activity, what your income eligibility definition is, what forms you're going to use, and be able to kind of walk somebody through it. I find that you may cover, this is where it is in the home regulation, or this is where it is in CDBG. But what I have found is that, not everyone has sort of step-by-step instructions. You might recall to the first part of our presentation together, I mentioned sort of general rules of thumb about using like quarterly income, or using, the hourly wage rate and multiplying that times like 2080 for 40 hours a week times 52 weeks for a year. I mean, those types of calculation rules of thumb, even if you use the calculator, it's really helpful if you document sort of how you're doing income eligibility, what documents you require as an organization. And that may be different than somebody else who could be hired into your position, or it may be different than somebody who had your position before. So it's really important to have the documentation in place that reaches back to the regulation or reaches back to the DCED guidance or your application, if you happen to use an application. Like what are you covering in terms of income eligibility? And if somebody coming in as a third party, can they review that documentation? And then it's really helpful to have, and I don't know if you folks do that, but you might have a tag team process. You might have somebody in your office like yourself that does like the intake process. And then you may have like a manager or somebody else, just a second person in your office, kind of test. Let's test these procedures against how income eligibility is done. Again, using the calculator or not using the calculator. And then hopefully, I really feel strongly that policies and procedures and guidance that you use in terms of how you operate as an organization, that changes over time. So you should amend it after you've done some of this self-monitoring to make sure that everything is as good as it can be. Or as part of this course, you can use the PowerPoints, the TA manual to, kind of grade yourself and figure out like where you could be clear. Another thing we talked about was folks making reapplication. Maybe that's something you might want to have on your list. Like, do I have a policy if folks can come back and apply after 6 months or a year? Maybe I have people wait like a year to reapply. So whatever it is, like in terms of your program, get that codified as much as you can. And then I did want to add here on this particular slide, we have, it's sort of like you have the luxury, or it's maybe challenging, because as part of this presentation, we talked about sort of the general income rules of thumb, and then all of a sudden now we all have COVID. sort of rules of thumb that include income eligibility for rental and for tenant-based rental assistance. So it may be that you need to have sort of like something that you can hopefully rip out of your procedures eventually and we burn it, once COVID is over, but there might be some shorter term policies or processes or forms that you use because of COVID. So definitely kind of keep that in mind. That should also be part of it. And I mentioned before there's a number of documents on the HUD exchange related to rental and tenant-based rental assistance and the waivers that have been made available. Yesterday, we talked about adjusted income and tenant-based rental assistance, and I mentioned that there are some forms for emergency tenant-based rental assistance that are on the HUD exchange. There are also a form that we just finished up today that should be published tomorrow. That's that new rental, new TBRA self-certification form that looks like a virtual application. That hopefully will go out in a listserv if you receive that from the HUD exchange. And if we have time at the end of the presentation, I'm happy to pull up the HUD exchange and I can show you. If you need to know where to go, I can certainly show that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about timing. I might have mentioned in passing as I do the first section on annual income, I might have mentioned that you have to income qualify the household that you're working with before you provide assistance, which that may seem dumb, but the assistance being, different depending upon what we're talking about. So for owner-occupied rehabilitation, we have to do income eligibility before we provide assistance, but it can also be no longer than 6 months. So if you do income eligibility on July 1st, and today is July 1st, then that means you have to serve them before the end of this calendar year. That is 6 months. So depending upon how you run your program, and particularly state programs, in my experience, is that you may you might collect some applications, and then depending upon, the time available for the rehab to be done, and with our construction companies, things like that, it could be longer than 6 months. So what I always tell folks is try to shore up the time between the applications the homeowner is applying to your program, and then when you provide the assistance. So the assistance comes, at least for home, must be a written agreement between you, the grantee, and the homeowner. The construction contractor may be maybe a three-party contract. But you have to make sure that you've conveyed the home assistance within the 6 months in this written agreement, okay? So, and you guys may call it contract. I mean, every state's a little bit different, but you need to make sure that happens. So however you can kind of shrink that down. If you need to, some people for owner-occupied rehabilitation may do like a simple application that might be like a pre-application until you can make sure that they can be served with your home funds and the rehabilitation to start. So everyone's a little bit different in terms of that. Hopefully I've said enough, but we can still keep talking about this. So that was our home owner slide. This is our home buyer slide. So it's a little bit different for home buyer, but it's the same is true in terms of the 6 months. So you have to make sure that you income qualify them. Can't be any longer than, again, today's July 1st. They have to provide the home assistance, which in terms of home buyer, they need to close on the property if it's existing housing within our 6 month rule. If not, you have to requalify them, okay? So for existing housing, it is, again, signing the home written agreement and closing on the property, okay? So what's a little bit different if it's not existing housing are these two kind of not well known, but for lease purchase, and I can't remember, and forgive me, Kimberly, if there's any lease purchase, either now or in the future, but I'll cover it in case there is. So you can do lease purchase. It's up to 36 months in the home program. Then you have an additional 6 months to transfer to a home buyer, but you have to gauge the 6 month rule based upon the time the lease purchase agreement was signed. And then if you do some type of newly constructed home, So like maybe you have Habitat that you're working with, and Habitat constructs a new home, you can actually use the construction contract, the new construction contract. You can use that instead of the home assistance in a written agreement. So existing must be home written agreement. For these other ones, you get a little bit longer because lease purchase, it takes them time to purchase the unit, and also to build a home sometimes takes a little bit longer than 6 months. It just gives you a little bit of extra time. So for example, like, besides Habitat, the city of Indianapolis did an amazing sort of like home-a-rama and built a bunch of new homes. One of my friends actually lives there in the Fall Creek Place neighborhood. So she signed an agreement. It took it like a construction contract. It took a year and a half for that townhome to be built. So that was totally fine, met the deadline in terms of the home requirements. So that was home buyer. Tenant-based rental assistance, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. We realize not a lot of you are doing TBRA, but basically you have to do income eligibility before you sign the TBRA contract with your client. And then you know that you have to do, like, income eligibility is done every single year in TBRA, okay? This is for rental activities. So this is for, those that are property owners and managers on the call. So the timing of rental assistance. So before you sign the lease for the unit, you have to do income eligibility. It's usually not a big deal in rental because you usually do income qualifications, and you figure out what they're, if they're eligible for a rental unit. That usually works out well when you have, vacancies and you can serve them right away. What doesn't work as well is that if we've got properties with a really long waiting list, some folks, decide to do a full application. Some other folks do like a pre-application. But basically, you want to figure out what's going to work best in your property, and that may vary property to property. But you may have to redo income eligibility if it's been longer than 6 months. Okay, so so take a look at that. So that's kind of, that's just a good kind of stopping point, since I mentioned sort of timing and things like that. Let me just make sure we don't have any questions, in the queue. I know I chatted back with somebody about some gas or oil type income, but what else is in the queue, Kimberly, if you don't mind, taking a look before we get into annual re-exams, which only impacts rental?
There are no questions, just a request to forward the materials for the presentation.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. And if the person wrote back about the gas and the oil particular income source, if you can just keep writing us back, I just want to make sure that I completely understand before I provide an answer. Okay, so in terms of annual re-examinations, so what is required at the time of initial application, we had to do the 2 months of source documentation. Folks might remember that from the second in this webinar series. So in terms of re-exams, which you do have to do in home rental, okay, and if CDBG is provided from the state, which is rare, I hear, they're following the same rule. So you can, and it would depend on your written agreement, but it sounds like you guys may have separate written agreements as grantees with property owners and managers. Just see what you said about, do you have to keep doing source documentation every single year? Or maybe you want to exercise the option to just collect like a self-certification from a family. And that would be, the self-certification could be something like a place where the household could provide their name, number of people who are living in the rental unit, and then they hereby swear that their income is below, and they could check off like the number of people in the household and the appropriate income limit and say, okay, my income's below that level. This works really well if you've got sort of duplexes or, a place where you've got like a small number of units, and also we have them in Ohio where we have an owner that has one unit and then they rent out their second unit. So those kind of mom and pop or small landlords, they really find it helpful just to do a self-certification because, you know, you guys just went through this course with me. You have to kind of know how to do income eligibility. Some of your small owners and homeowners may not understand that if they happen to have a rental unit. So self-certifications can go a long way. And then finally, the other option is that you could have a written statement from, I'm just going to use the housing authority. So maybe the family receives Section 8. So if they receive Section 8 voucher from the housing authority, you could probably get some sort of statement from the housing authority that says, yes, I've income qualified this household. They're continuing to be eligible. You can do that throughout the period of affordability. You can exercise one of those options so long as it's in your written agreement and you have the ability to exercise that option. However, the only difference is that every 6th year of the period of affordability, and you folks might remember in home, it's 5, 10, or 15 years for existing housing or for rehabilitated housing, and 20 years for new construction. And the 5, 10, or 15 depends on the amount of home assistance per unit. So every 6th year of the period of affordability, so basically if there's a 10-year period of affordability, year 6 of the property, you have to do source documentation. So sometimes people are like, you know what, I can't track the 6th year, Shauna. I'm just going to go ahead and require source documentation. That seems to be the easiest thing. So some people might decide that that's how they want to operate their rental property, and that might be fine for them. We also used to say that when home was combined with the low-income housing tax credits, we used to say, okay, if it's home and LIHTC together, LIHTC for years used to require source documentation. Now they've had a lot of flexibility since 2008 with some of the stimulus acts out there that they could actually do either entire property, doesn't have to income qualify every year, or it might be building by building. There's been a lot of flexibility. So if you are working with a property that's home and might have LIHTC, then we really need to lean on heavily the LIHTC rules for the timing of recertifications and things like that, okay? But definitely at least every 6th year must do source for home. And then I mentioned before, tenant-based rental assistance, income must be examined annually, okay? And you're always going to use source documentation. But again, as we learned, there's not all of you are doing tenant-based rental assistance from yesterday. So we always get questions about, okay, great, Shauna, so now you're telling me I have to recertify or re-examine income. Like, when do I do it? So let's just use today's example. So today's July 1st. Today is the first day of the new 2020 income limits for home, for CDBG. So this is when we'd start using the 2020 income limits. So that means any new applicant, I'd use the 2020 income limits to qualify the household. And then I would also say for reexaminations that once the tenant needs to be recertified, it might be the anniversary date of the last initial verification, might be at lease renewal, or sometimes some property owners and managers like to get everyone on the same schedule. So maybe every year they do income eligibility maybe in July because they know they'll have the new income limits as of that date. So there's a lot of flexibility so long it's been no longer than 12 months, okay? So, so that's one thing to keep in mind. And then CDBG recertification is not required. It's only a 5-year period of compliance, it looks like, and they keep the rents affordable. So for this particular reexamination, we really wouldn't have very much for CDBG. But for home, we've got to recertify or reexamine, and these at least give you some options. So this is what is an example of a 20-year period of affordability. POA is period of affordability. So remember, we always use source documentation, initial occupancy. So that's the first sort of round button in this arrow. And then, maybe, the people that have lived in the property, maybe the 4th year of the project, you can use other other options such as the family recerts, self-recerts, or another governmental entity does recertification. And then in our example here, we've got Mrs. Jones moving into our property. And it's the 5th year of the period of affordability for the project, but she's at move-in. So her initial occupancy is always with Source. And then the next year, the 6th year, that's the entire project, we would have to use Source documentation with Mrs. Jones again. So the tenant always gets recertified. The tenant at initial occupancy is always going to have Source documentation. And then you have to look at the project each and every year after that to see where you are. Do you do Source documentation? Do you kind of see why some people have said, I'll just do Source documentation every year? But we know that it's a lot of work to do income eligibility. So anyway, it's an option. So the 10th year of the period of affordability, kind of following the next, arrow here, other options are acceptable. And then the 12th year, you do Source documentation again. So year 6, year 12, and then I don't have this year, but year 18 of the period of affordability, at least 3 times over a 20-year period of affordability, you must do full income eligibility with Source documentation. So hopefully seeing this sort of lined up and more of a visual would be really helpful for you to see. So is this all making sense? Does anyone have questions about timing or about reexaminations of income? I'm going to look here to see if there's anything else. Okay. So we have somebody that wrote in and wanted to know about the new estimated income limits that are effective today. So you have 2 options. So, and I'm happy to show this in the presentation. You can just go to the HUD Exchange if you're used to going there and grab the Pennsylvania income limits. But if you're not, I don't know if you're getting our emails or not, but you can also sign up on the HUD Exchange to receive notifications. And unless it came out while I was sitting here, we have not sent out the listserv message for today. So in case you do get the income related messages from the HUD Exchange, it hadn't gone out yet. I was trying to push to get it out, but they are in effect today, and so you will get that notification from the listserv. DCED, do you provide, do you forward links like that, or do you have something that you send out to your grantees?
Yes, Shauna. As a matter of fact, all of our grantees should have received it last week in the form of a CD&H alert and update. So if this particular grantee that has the question, requesting it, I'd encourage them to go back through their CD&H alerts and look for it. And if not, reach out to their assigned grant manager, and we can certainly get that information into their hands.
Okay, perfect. That sounds like a great process, Kimberly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So another question here is about owner-occupied rehabilitation and the number of pay stubs for the Part 5 definition. So you need to have 2 months, so the 60 days is what's required in terms of documentation. There hadn't been anything codified in the home final rule with the number of pay stubs or the length of time, but that changed with the 2013 home final rule. So you might have seen 90 before because that's in the technical guide, which I'll touch on briefly in the presentation, but that's the guide that I mentioned had, at least yesterday, it has really good information on tenant-based rental assistance, but it has outdated guidance on annual income. So 60 days, you're good. And if it goes a little bit over, that's fine. And then if you do like to do third party, just as an aside, it's okay to do third party or a verification with the employer, but you still have to collect the pay stubs too. And I understand that that feels like double work, but they, HUD is very concerned about 60 days of pay stubs. Okay. I feel like that that's more helpful than third party. So the next question I see in the queue is, what happens if you recertify and the household is over the income limit? I will do, CDBG is easy. There is nothing you need to do. For home, you do need to take a look at how your project has been designed. So, and we do not have a rental module as a part of this training, but there are a couple of guides I could recommend. I can pull the link, or maybe Chantal can help me with a link to the guide to property owners and home assisted units. But you need to make sure you have the right unit mix. And what I mean by that is, do you have enough units that are at the low home limit that is serving folks at 50% or less of area median income? And do you have enough home units in your project? If you look at income eligibility and you've got folks that go over income. And over income to me means above 80%. So there are things that you have to do, such as swapping out the unit, not literally making somebody move, but you've made a unit substitution. Maybe there's another household in the property who is income eligible, who could benefit from a home rent limit that's more affordable to them. And so the answer becomes, is your property 100% home? Is it partially home where you've got like information where you can kind of slide people in terms of they can start paying the home rent and you make adjustments? You just simply can switch somebody into a market rate rent and the income qualified household would go into the home assisted unit. Again, typically not a move. Typically it's just, they just sort of swap. The only exception to that is if you have other HUD funds or you've got the low income housing tax credit, and then for those, then we really have to have a more complicated discussion about what that unit mix looks like. And is it home and another type of assistance? Because home with tax credits and over income, home defers to tax credits in terms of what you do with the unit for the most part. So we can get you that property owner. There's a PJ version, which is good for grantees, about rental housing and about compliance. There's some scenarios there. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of information. You don't want to kick them out, y'all. I mean, that is unacceptable. You don't want anything like that to happen. They were income qualified to begin with. They benefited from an affordable unit. Hopefully we're in this business to create wealth and to help people so that as their income goes up, then they can start paying a market rate rent or something like that. So that's helpful. Let's see, what else we got here? Oh, thanks. So if you, Lisa in particular, since you asked the question, in the chat box is a link to the property manager's guide for rental housing compliance. Lots of good information there that we haven't been able to cover in this series. Let's see, do we have other questions? Doesn't look like it. Okay. Okay. Has anyone else chatted, or are we good to move on in the material? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on with the material. Okay. Okay, so in terms of general record keeping, I would like to go ahead and switch over here to Mentimeter. Okay, great. All right, gold star for all you rock stars. So before I get into the material, it's always fun to ask this question about how are your records kept? And DCED may have their own particular ways in which they like to respond to the material as I kind of talk about it. But I want to know, are you keeping records hard copy? Are you keeping electronic? Or, you know, it might be a combination of both. Might be a combination of both. give people a little bit of time to respond here. I know this is something that a lot of folks have been talking to us about in terms of, you know, especially during COVID, like having our SharePoint sites or our Google Docs, or maybe, you know, you in the office, you know, working with a client, you might be doing something long distance. Having it electronically can really be helpful, so that you're able to, you can keep working and keep serving the folks that you want to serve. Now, some documents, and we'll talk about this in the presentation, some documents, you know, need to have that inked copy, need to have hard copy. So, so we can kind of talk about what are some general rules of thumb there. So, for example, like written agreements with homeowners, home buyers, those are typically inked, need to be hard copy, but you might scan it in. Some people have chosen to do that in their program. It's very difficult to do like a fully electronic process. I have seen some property owners and managers. I've seen, I know folks are on here from the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency or PHFA. A lot of HFAs have been able to go all electronic. They even sit HUD down when they visit them and do a monitoring visit where HUD literally sees everything on a screen, okay? So some of you might be able to get away with that for a lot of your documents. Okay, great. So it looks like most people are in now, I think. So electronic and hard copy. Wonderful. I'm going to pause that for a second. Okay. So general record keeping requirements. So in terms of, you know, must have a written agreement, you know, make sure that you're following your record keeping and retention requirements. For the home program, in general, it's 5 years. And for some documents, like tenant files, other documents or other timekeeping timeframes are 5 years after the period of affordability. So for example, like if it happens to be the original development of the property, that first initial agreement, all of those things are kept for 5 years after the period of affordability. So you want to make sure you're following the requirements. So make sure that your records are maintained, and you guys know this, but it bears repeating that they really need to be in a central location. You know, Bob, the rehab guy in your office, may have his own files for a period of time, but there's some sort of like, let me go ahead and put this in our central file folder system, so that you make sure that Bob's, you know, Bob's final documents or documents where somebody needs to review are in a central location. You may have folks that ask you, and I'm sure you have as grantees of these important programs, where maybe citizens or other people, members of the general public, they want to see who's being served by your program. We've all got those calls. So it's just important that you make sure that you've got documentation so that you can respond to those requests. And sometimes those requests can be handled with, you know, here's the number of people who applied. These are the, you know, people that we have, the number of people we've served. But obviously keep personal identifiable information, you know, separate and protected. So here's some examples of, if we're talking about the income records for homeowner programs or home buyer programs, what I would at least expect to see in terms of just income files. Okay, there's going to be lots of other documents for homeowner or home buyer. But basically, the applicant file should include the application that the household signed and provided to you. You need to know, like, not just the number of household members, but anything else that sort of helps you with getting to know that household, the ages, their income and asset sources. We mentioned that as part of the team manual, there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of benefit to a sworn income and asset statement, particularly for a home buyer, so that you make sure that the household signs off on all their income and asset sources. We provided a sample for you. But all other sort of, if they have self-certification of income, if they have, you know, documentation, like number of pay stubs, things like that. So you're going to have all of like the backup documentation that's been verified. Your income calculation worksheet, that's something that we showed in the calculator a couple times, where for annual income, you can print it out as a PDF, put that in the file. You can also print out the income limit page, and then you can make sure that you have a signed copy of that. And then definitely the written agreement with the household that the household says that they're income qualified. Those are the types of things that we would expect to find in terms of income records for both homeowner and home buyer. You're going to have other things about the property itself. If there was rehabilitation work to happen, you know, that would be also documented in the files. For rental, here's a couple things that we would want to see in the files. Kind of gets into a little bit about what we talked about when we were asked the question about being over the income limit. So files should contain, obviously, the tenant application, information about the household, ages, other income eligibility criteria that you may have, and whether or not they're going to live in a home rent that's considered high or low. So I mentioned if you live in a low home rent unit, you have to be at or below 50% of area median income. For high, you can be all the way up to 80% of area median income, all the way down to 0. So people either live in a low home rent or a high home rent, and that's what I was saying is when we do our review of the unit mix, we need to make sure we have the correct number of low. And I think we talked about this in the first part of the session. We have income targeting you have to do. 5 or more home assisted units. You have to make sure at least 20% are at the low home rent limit. So very important that you make sure that you have enough lows, and if you need to identify more tenants in your property to meet that requirement, you need to do so. So you need to make sure that you have information on the calculation worksheet, the documentation. This is the method of income verification. I mean, that would be true for the last slide as well. I don't think I had that on that slide, but Part 5 or the IRS definition, we need to make sure we have that. And then for this, in order to test the 6-month rule, we have to have a tenant lease. So for rental programs, that lease is going to help us with the 6-month rule. Different from owner-occupied rehabilitation or home buyer, that is the home agreement, and we need to test it with the home written agreement, okay? So, and then finally, we do have to document if there was any type of termination. Again, that would help us to understand how long they were living in the unit. It helps us with income targeting. That's what we need to look for in terms of rental. Okay, I am going to pause there and see if we have any questions in the queue.
Shauna, we have a question asking, when doing sewer laterals for homeowners, what type of written agreement do we need since they sign the application? And that would be a CDBG question, so I will ask Donna if she would respond to that one, please. Because this would be under the 14A housing rehab activity, Shauna, that DCED allows.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure I was unmuted. Yes, this is Donna, and we would expect the same type of agreement that you would have for housing rehab. Same provisions, it's just your scope of work is going to be different, but you're still going to have an agreement between the homeowner and the contractor who's doing the lateral work. And then if there's something different that I'm not getting from this question, I would say just email me and we can discuss further. Thank you.
Shauna, that was the only question that had come in since.
Okay, great. So I am going to go ahead and in the chat box, that gave me a second. Thanks, Kimberly. Thanks, Donna, on helping with that particular question. I also decided to, Chantel provided the guide for property owners for rental housing. compliance, but I wanted also to provide the PJ guide, which might be helpful for grantees if you happen to be overseeing a portfolio of rental projects. And so, and I also know, again, we might have folks from PHFA on the call. But my only caveat, these were last updated in 2012, so they predate the home final rule. And this is one of those that is not available for the changes that have been made from the home final rule. It's slated to be updated. There's a version that we've been working on, but it has not been published yet. But just thought you might want to take a look at both. The property owner manual is actually written for property owners, so it's just the way in which it speaks about the particular areas, about what their options are. It'll say things like, should check with the PJ, which is participating jurisdiction, which means you as the grantee or DCED. It'll say like, check about this, or look at your written agreement. The guide for PJ is a little bit more open. It gives you more options, and it's just a little bit more of, let me go through all the options, as opposed to what we wrote for property managers and owners. Just thought that would be helpful. So I'm gonna, I know I went back to the slides, but I did think that it might be helpful just before our quick break here to go ahead and show on the HUD Exchange where you can find the income limit, since that was a question, and I know we're still waiting to see that listserv message again, unless it came out as I was on. So you just go to hudexchange.info, and again, I know you got this from DCED, but we do want you to help yourself on the HUD Exchange. Underneath limits and allocations, income limits are here, rent limits are here. Rent limits are also effective as of today. So if you're working in a home rental unit project, you'll want to take a look at that. So I'm just going to select income limits. And then I just kind of bypass the top. It just gives you a little bit of background about the limits. But and you can actually go back in time. We have at least 10, 15 years of income limits. But you would just simply go down to, okay, I'm not in Alabama. I'm in Pennsylvania. And actually, I have a tip for you guys related to these income limits. So, so you just open this, and then I usually tell people to go ahead and just, download this file, keep it on your desktop, things like that. So probably one of the most common questions that we get is that, and particularly for state programs, is that you have to figure out, am I in a metropolitan statistical area, MSA, or am I like in a county? Like, am I working in that particular county? And then sometimes you're like, I can't find my county at all, or I can't find my city. I don't know where I need to go. So, so it would be really helpful if you got to know the area. I call it the area memo, but it is this, let's see, area definition, sorry. So this area definitions, and you can go down to the state of Pennsylvania, which I will do, and this is where you can check just to make sure, okay? Like, what are all of the, and this is good for the state too, just in case, folks at the state want to see this, but it just spells out who is included, like, for example, and I know this comes out from a different part of HUD, but who's in this Allentown, Bethlehem, Easton, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, like MSA. And then it includes these particular folks, okay, these particular areas. So this is one of the #1 questions we at least get nationally is kind of, I don't see my jurisdiction, if I were like in Bucks County, maybe I would think I was in the Philly area, but if I'm new to the program or new to income eligibility, I might not realize that Bucks County is in the Philadelphia, Camden, Wilmington, MSA. So I really find this, area memo, area definitions, I find this to be incredibly helpful. At the same time, I look at the income limits, across the state, depending upon where I'm working. So wanted to show you that. And then if you flip here to the home rent limits, if you happen to be working in home rental, again, these were just updated for 2020. There is a little information about the home rent limit, things like that. Okay, so I thought that might be helpful to share as we go into our 10-minute break for today. So I really encourage you guys to take a break here, but certainly we want all your income eligibility questions in the Q&A. I really appreciate the ones that have been asked already. Please continue to ask questions in there, and then we have plenty of time in this session to handle all of your questions. So we'll see you back here at 3 o'clock. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you had a good break. I promise we're not going to go all the way to 4 o'clock, but I thought we all could use a little break. I know we're doing a lot of things virtually these days. I'm going to just see what kind of questions we have in the box, and then we'll move on in the presentation. So what do we have here?
Shauna, I am not seeing any in the chat or the Q&A.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. Maybe we've answered everything. Okay, great. All right, well, I will continue with the presentation, and please make sure you write your questions in. So we talked about income records for rental. We thought, we have a couple slides here about just some questions that, maybe DCED when they monitor you, or potentially when you're doing some self-monitoring. What do you kind of want to look for? So, a couple things that we thought were kind of more the most important that income eligibility dovetails with rental programs. So obviously you have to do your annual income recertifications. We talked about the options for those. Source documentation, or one of those two other options where you have a governmental entity who signs off on the household income, or they do self-certification. And so whatever you've decided, to do, just make sure that you're following up and looking to make sure you're meeting the every 6th year of the period affordability rule in terms of source documentation. So make sure you're doing that. We mentioned a little bit because somebody asked about over income, but you really do need to make sure that the right rents are being charged for the properties. I mentioned before that anyone can live in a high home unit from 0% of area median income all the way to 80% of area median income. In a low home unit, 50% or less of area median income all the way down to 0. So you really need to make sure that you're paying attention to those. And we mentioned that you absolutely have to meet the low home unit requirements. We do have some requirements if, not just that the right rent is being charged. We need to make sure that the right rents are being charged to the unit. They're not old rents. And typically, I think somebody had asked about when you can start using the new rent and income limits. I mean, you can use them as soon as they're available. They become effective the day they come out. And depending upon your processes, and typically with re-examinations of income, you're really looking at, what does the lease require you to do? So usually you have some time, to implement those new income limits and to implement those new rent limits. But there's no like 30 days or whatever. You probably have something in your leases with your tenants more than anything else. So you're going to look at, we provide nationally, the home rent limits come out as max rent limits, same as income limits, but you do want to make sure that utility allowances are current and they're being deducted properly from those max rents. And then, as we mentioned, we do have to do unit substitution if you're over income. While somebody can live in a home assisted unit that's high home, we still have income targeting that has to be done. So we mentioned in the first part of our training that the program role is for those, and it's always initial occupancy. It's for both rental and TBRA, is that we have what's called the program role, which says 90% of our beneficiaries that are served are at or below 60% of area median income. So you've got some initial targeting that you have to do. That's an initial occupancy, and then over the period of affordability, you have the project role, which I mentioned is if you have 5 or more home assisted units, then you have 20% or less that are at the low home rent, which is 50% or less of area median income. Targeting for CDBG, you're really looking at if I've got more than 2 units in my rental property, at least 51% have to be low and moderate income, or LMI. Okay. So that was rental, just kind of asking some questions. And then the only difference with income records for tenant-based rental assistance is what we talked about yesterday. So you really need to understand which model you're using for tenant-based rental assistance, whether or not you're using the certificate model or maybe you're using the voucher model. And we spent a lot of time yesterday kind of talking about the differences between the two. I know I didn't have specific slides to kind of run through them, primarily because home doesn't use the certificate model. You may have some older programs that do, but the certificate model is where what the tenant pays is constant, and it's always 30% of their income toward rent and utilities. It somewhat limits them in terms of what kind of property they're able to rent a unit from, which is why over the course of the last decade and housing authorities or longer, we've really been making sure people are using the Section 8 voucher, which you can actually pay more or less than 30% of your income toward rent and utilities. It gives the tenant, or in this case the TBRA recipient, more options in the marketplace, and you can spend up to 40% of your income on rent and utilities, at least if it's a housing authority program. So most people are using the voucher approach. You're going to have in your files not just the application, not just the income calculation worksheet for annual income, but you're going to have the adjusted income calculation. You're also going to have the tenant-based rental assistance calculation so that you know how much you are able to provide as the administrator of tenant-based rental assistance. And then you are going to have the lease and also the TBRA agreement, as well as any annual recerts of income, and then termination if that's necessary. So that was tenant-based rental assistance. Again, I know a lot of people are not doing it, but we seem to have a little interest yesterday and maybe starting up a program potentially. So record retention requirements. So for home buyer, we need to make sure that we are keeping our records, we're retaining them for at least 5 years after project completion. So we mentioned for rental, we had the 5, 10, or 15 years of the period of affordability, and that was for existing housing or for rehabilitated rental housing. What project completion means is that, in the period of affordability for home buyer, you still have the 5, 10, or 15 years, depending upon the amount of home buyer assistance, but you need to keep the records after whichever period of affordability you're living through. So if it's a 5-year period of affordability, then you have to keep the home buyer records for 5 years because project completion was just 5 years. If it's a 10-year period of affordability, then you're going to keep it for 5 years after the period of affordability. If we've got resale recapture, which is our written agreement requirements for how the property is sold and handled over time. So just a couple things there in terms of record retention. Home buyer records for like income eligibility, or if you did any type of rehab, that would be that initial 5-year period. But if we're talking about anything that impacts the period of affordability, like resale recapture, we're talking 5 years after the 5, 10, or 15-year period of affordability is over. Homeowner rehabilitation, it's 5 years after project completion. You don't have to keep the records any longer than that. And then for rental, most records are kept for 5 years after project completion. So for example, like tenant income or inspections, things like that. That's for that initial 5-year period. Then anything that relates to the affordability period, so the written agreement, the deed restriction, I would even argue like the initial unit mix and occupancy reports. Like you need to see this project kind of soup to nuts. I would make sure that those are kept until 5 years after the affordability period terminates. And then finally, if you do happen to provide tenant-based rental assistance, it's 5 years after you terminate the rental assistance. Some programs have tenants that are served every single year over and over again in tenant-based rental assistance, or some people do 2-year contracts. You can always renew the contract, so it just depends on how long you provide assistance to the family. But in terms of retention of records, you're going to keep it for 5 years after you terminate the rental assistance that's been provided. So I'm going to pause there. That's a lot on record keeping. Want to make sure that we got some questions that are answered. Is there anything in the queue, Kimberly, that we can talk about as a group?
We had a question come in asking how soon after the income limits are released do they have to be implemented? And I would just like to share that in our CD&H alert that did get released last week to practitioners, that it was indicated that they were effective today, July 1. And that we would also follow up and let grant administrators, grantees know when the income calculator was updated and so on. So that question was an easy one to answer today.
Okay, great. Thanks for that clarification. And yeah, it's just one of those things. They're effective the day that HUD has said that they're effective, and you just start using them. So great. All right. Do we have other questions in the queue?
No, that's the only question that I'm seeing right now. I would just like to say that I think in conjunction and on top of answering that question, you had shared in a previous session how it is to be handled if new income limits become applicable while someone is administering their program. So say they income qualified one family, last week, and now we're looking at, new income limits this week. So maybe that might be something to review, just to provide a little more insight and guidance again, and to reiterate that.
Yeah, sure. And we know that, and I get these emails every year about like when are the new income limits are coming out, and we know it takes a while to income qualify a household. So what typically happens is that and again, it sounds like DCED is mimicking what HUD is doing, which is great. So you're notified usually 2 to 4 weeks in advance of the effective date of the new income limits, and if you happen to be doing home rents, when the home rents are available and their effective date. This year, it ended up being a little bit over 2-week notice. So hopefully you received that immediately, and then also you knew about the effective date. So let's say you were working with a family last week, and maybe you were able to do all their documentation. Maybe you were able to income qualify them. So long as you documented, and I showed you guys in the calculator, which I'm happy to show again, you can do a PDF of that income limit page so that everyone knows, like you income qualified them as of, for the 2019 income limits. And you could have done that every single day this week, with the exception of if you were awake overnight doing income eligibility, that's when we flipped the switch. And I tried to convey that to you all, that even yesterday, how important it is to save your calculations, which means save that, again, the PDF of the income eligibility worksheet. And we also communicated, and I'm not sure if DCE did this, but we sent out an email message to the listserv on Monday of this week saying, please save your calculations. This is something we just started to do, which we've gotten really good feedback about, because we're trying to constantly communicate with grantees that, this will change anyone who you're working with in the calculator. Now, if you're working outside the calculator, then you're going to have to figure out what's going to work best from the time that you're notified that the income limits are out, and then the current household that you're serving. Some people look and they compare the two income limits and like, we need Mrs. Jones to be income qualified today. I'm going to hurry this up as quickly as I can. Others maybe, and I have not compared, and I'm sorry, sometimes we've seen the income limits go down, which has been helpful. But most of my career, we've seen either the income limits going up, or we've seen them sort of like barely go up, or not at all, because incomes unfortunately have been stagnant. So hopefully that helps. Were you thinking of anything else, Kimberly, that you wanted me to mention in that?
No, that was very helpful. And I just wanted to share also, Shauna, that when we sent that CD&H alert last week, we also included the home rent limits as well.
Oh, great. Great. Thank you.
We try to be as proactive and as far in advance as what we can.
Okay, wonderful.
And I'm not seeing any other new questions at this point.
It looks, maybe this was just sent to me about the record retention period for owner-occupied rehabilitation.
Okay.
So it says, what is the record retention period for owner-occupied housing rehab? What about DCED's requirements to retain files for 5 years after DCED closes out the contract with HUD? Can you help with that question, or maybe Donna?
Shauna, could you just repeat that for me? Because I want to make sure. I did initially think they were talking about CDBG.
Yeah, right. Me too. Okay, no problem, because it's all of the slides, right, have been talking about 5-year initial period and then 5 years after the period of affordability. So it's kind of large home slanted, okay, if you will.
Right.
So, so the question here is about what is record retention period for owner-occupied housing rehab? What about DCED's requirement to retain files for 5 years after DCED closes out the contract with HUD?
Okay, so I'm going to answer this in 2 ways. One, I want to take a look at our housing rehab guidebook to see if it does need to be changed. That's number one, because I am not quite certain if we have anything about record retention in the housing rehab guidebook. But number 2, at least for CDBG, and again, I'm just going to have to confirm this and look at our latest closeout letter, is that in the CDBG rules, I believe the units of local government have to maintain their files for 4 years after closeout. It used to be 5, but I think we've checked the regs and it's 4. So we will get that out as clarifying information on the CDBG side of it. I'll speak with Kimberly as to, anything that we haven't gone over or needs clarification, how we'll send that out to everyone who's attended. But I've marked it here to follow up.
Okay, and I'm happy to help you folks at DCED as well. I think that sounds right, Kimberly, or sorry, Donna, I apologize. The only thing in the back of my mind is I thought with the new uniform, the Omni Circular, I thought it standardized it across all of our programs to 5 years. So I think that there may be something there we could also triple check together, and it's just not coming to mind, because 4 used to be that was the CDBG rule. After it was 3 years, then it became 4. Anyway, so yeah, so it sounds like we'll get back to you, but thanks so much for raising that question.
And Donna, I happen to have a copy of the current housing rehab guidebook in my hands, and I looked, and there's nothing referencing record retention in the actual guidebook itself. I did not look in the home application kit or in the appendix that's specific to EOOH. It could possibly be in there, so I will also verify that.
Well, what I have to say is the good news is that if it's not in the housing rehab guidebook, it's one of our guides that we do not have to update, so that's a good thing. We will get clarification.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, of course. Thanks so much. So, okay, seeing no questions in here, we have a couple things to kind of talk about, and then we'll also do some Mentimeter and, kind of learn from each other here in terms of what folks are planning to do next. As you know, we did spend some time putting together a TA manual that was specific to income eligibility, although we did find that it would be helpful to provide things around your application, what makes a good application. There are forms in there, so we put that together. I have some very minor edits given the webinar series that I feel like are necessary. There was the questions about live-in aids in particular. I realized that definition wasn't in there. So just a couple things I would like to provide to you folks that I think would be really helpful. So look for an email communication on an updated TA manual. I spent some time yesterday, for those that joined us, for adjusted income that's used for tenant-based rental assistance. And I showed the technical guide, which I can also show once I switch over to Chrome. I just want to make sure, I covered it yesterday because it is so out of date. It's 15 years old. It's still out of date for annual income. So when I talked early in the presentation, like the majority of what we've been talking about is income eligibility. That's annual income, okay? I just don't think the technical guide is as helpful, but I do think that you can use it for, again, tenant-based rental assistance can be very helpful, particularly the voucher section. They haven't changed the voucher requirements since 2005, so they're fine to use. And then there are forms in the back of the book, which I linked to in the TA manual, the ones that I think are really helpful. So there's one that's like a form for a cash business, net income from a business, cash contributions is also on the form. I think I have the home release form that I mentioned. So there are good forms to use in there if you don't have one for your program. I believe they're all in PDF, so you'd have to convert them to Word, which I think is easier today than what it used to be. But that could be really helpful to you. And then certainly take a look at the new COVID-19 form for new rental, new emergency tenant-based rental assistance. That could be really helpful. But just know you can't use the technical guide for the IRS definition, and you can't and really shouldn't for Part 5 because we've had so many changes. So I thought, too, that it would be helpful to mention that this act that was signed into law by President Obama in 2016 made some changes to income eligibility that are still forthcoming. And it's underneath the Housing Opportunity Through Modernization Act, or HOTMA, which is what I'm a mother, so I like to call myself that too. It's such a fun acronym. But what mostly happened is that if you work with the Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS program at all, HOPWA, is that they changed like the definition and formula of how that program allocates funding across the country, which is very interesting. That's been the majority, and there have been some HOPWA changes. However, there are going to be some changes to the Part 5 definition for both annual income and for adjusted income. And it was open for public comment through November of last year. And a lot of organizations, like DCED belongs to a national organization called COSDA, which is the Council of State Community Development Agencies. Like, everyone commented on this rule. So DCED like a lot of people commented because, as we kind of talked about, there could be some changes with additional income and asset sources that you guys have questions about or you think should be excluded. It just hasn't changed in a number of years. And then also things like the passbook rate for the Part 5 definition also could be reviewed, and not necessarily we have to wait for a notice to come out that the passbook rate changes nationally. Maybe it could be indexed. Like, there's some things that kind of came out. It was still a proposed rule. It's not final in terms of some of these changes. But we still thought it would be helpful to mention that while we did this training today, we do expect the changes from HOTMA to change how we calculate income in the future. And I felt remiss from like not putting something in the presentation that you could go back to and would be helpful to update this training in a year or two once some of those changes are made. But they literally haven't touched Part 5 in years. So just want to make sure that you saw that. So before I go to Mentimeter and we kind of talk through what's on your to-do list items, I have a bunch of ideas here that you could do in terms of your program. Lots of review and just triple checking your forms. But I don't want us to, I want to know what you think, and I want to make sure that I am showing you what is available. And for some reason, I don't have Chrome all of a sudden. That is so weird. Okay, so I can't share Chrome. So what am I going to share to get back to? Let me just see if I can pull up Chrome here. This is new to me, Chantel. Why didn't it not give me Chrome like it did? So let's talk about what your to-do list items are. Let's see what could be on your list. And maybe you could chat with us in the box since I can't pull this up right this second. So tell us what you're thinking about. Are you going to change your procedures? Are you going to change your templates? Let us know. And then maybe we'll take some questions since I can't change my screen. So what do we have in the inbox? Anything of note? Not yet.
Donna had started sharing something as far as.
Oh, geez. Okay.
Oh, yes. Oh, there you go. Donna had started sharing some notes on record retention, but it's not a complete thought because it ends at a colon. So I don't know if she's following up with the rest of that.
Okay, great. Maybe she just typed in a few things.
Yeah.
So, there are character limits in WebEx, so sometimes you might get caught with the character limit. Okay, so sorry about my snafu in Menti. For some reason, it wouldn't let me, like Chrome wasn't popping up. It popped up underneath Other, Share Other, and then I got to Chrome just for Chantal, who manages all things virtual. So yeah, what are you going to do? So it looks like either check or review your policies and procedures and make sure that, you know, hopefully that they're updated, that they contain everything that's sort of talked about in this course. At least one person wants to use the calculator, which is two, yay, are going to use the calculator. It'd be really helpful for you to do that. It really helps. And you have the income eligibility, inclusions, exclusions from Part 5 right there. I love the person who put add in divested asset information. So I believe what this person is talking about is they would like to look at that funny little rule in Part 5, which is if I own the asset for 2 years, you know, prior, then I still need, you know, up to 2 years prior, I need to include the value of that asset. So because you might have gotten rid of it below the fair market value. So good. I'm glad somebody's going to look at that particular question. Okay, what else do we see here? Lots of policies and procedures. Oh, intake. So looking at your intake specifically. So it might be that you want to look at, you know, your application there, or it might be that you want to add that question that we were talking about, such as if you want to count unborn children, do you expect your household composition to change over the next 12 months? That can also help for those that maybe haven't revealed to you the grantee that they are going to cohabitate with their boyfriend or girlfriend or what have you. So I think that would be really helpful. I think, and for some reason I can't see it, okay. I did not see that. Maybe some of you might go ahead and sign up. I know you get good stuff from DCED, but you know, if you're working actively in the home program or working actively in the CDBG program, I would strongly recommend that you sign up for the mailing list on the HUD Exchange, and you get to select which programs you want to hear about, or maybe you're somebody who's doing fair housing or environmental review. You can select, I know a bunch of you do IDIS, right? Because I was a part of some prior training. You're the only state still in the union where your DCED grantees are actually setting up activities in IDIS. So you can also get updates about IDIS through the HUD Exchange as well, and I would strongly recommend that. Okay. Okay. Well, I think that does it for that question. I'm gonna what am I gonna do? I'm gonna leave up this particular Mentimeter. I'm gonna have it now. You know, we do want your feedback about this session, but I don't want you to go anywhere yet. So it may be up on your phone on the other side, if I'm remembering correctly how this works. But I did want to make sure there was nothing that folks wanted to see on the HUD Exchange. I did want to make sure that it's underneath news is where you can subscribe. You see this like news and then subscribe. So the listserv or the email that you could receive is actually different than having a HUD Exchange account. I know I have a HUD Exchange account because my name's in the upper right-hand corner, and I use the calculator. But the calculator, you have to have a user account separate from, I simply want to receive, you know, email from HUD about income limits and other things. So this is where you would subscribe to the email. And then like you would put in your email address, your zip code, and then you can select everything you want to learn about, or maybe working with homeless programs. But it's pretty easy to sign up. And if you're already subscribed, you can just update your preferences we have like a large team of people that can really help you in terms of, determining like whether or not you need a hot exchange account for which type of application. We've got a lot of team members that can assist with that. So I'm going to leave up this and then just see what kind of questions we have in the box. If we can just see what's in the Q&A box, and also what else folks would like me to show them, which I'm very happy to do in our last 30 minutes. So I can show, we can talk about questions. What haven't we done in this webinar series? What would be helpful to you guys? Okay. Oh, now I'm seeing the chat about the reg reference.
Yes. Other than that, there has not been any.
Okay. Any other questions in the box? Okay. Oh, wait. So there's a question here about, just saw the response, a fund for the oil drilling. Oh, it's a fund set up on their property. They do gas and oil drilling. So the payment gives both a gross and a net amount. Okay, so thanks for that. So earlier in this training, it was asked about revenue or income or assets. Basically, like, what do I do with this gas or oil drilling? I have to say, Part 5 is based upon folks that are living in rental housing. So it's not those that actually have like this, like, where this is being done. So sometimes Part 5 doesn't cover every scenario. So I'm going to say, and DCED, see if you feel like this is reasonable. If this is a periodic payment and it comes in, monthly, weekly, etc., I probably would count it as an income source. If I receive it kind of sporadically, then I probably would count it as like, it's going to go in the savings account or something like that. So I would treat it like an asset, like a lump sum, like we talked about. So I treat it as a lump sum, and then you're going to see it in assets. Does that sound reasonable, a reasonable approach? So I would count that gross amount.
I do think that sounds reasonable, but I do think that if a grantee experiences this, that they would consult with DCED at that time, because we don't have anything in written form regarding guidance on that.
I think that makes sense. And then maybe we should understand more of the difference between that gross and that net. Like, what's the difference? Like,
yes, yeah.
Like, is it because it's on their property? Are there costs associated with hosting on their property that would yield a net amount? Or, you know what I mean? So knowing a little bit more would be helpful. I'm sorry, then there's more information. But the gross amount, I think people are just chatting with me. I'm sorry. But the gross amount has deductions taken. He reports he only gives the IRS net amount. So here's the thing. This is one of the fundamental differences between Part 5 and IRS, and I'm happy to revisit that if that's helpful. I often don't care what the IRS net amount is, because they're only looking at what's taxable. In Part 5, we're looking at gross. So if you're using the Part 5 definition, I would use gross. So I guess I was answering you, Jessica, based upon the Part 5 definition, and I apologize. I think I just went there because that's the most common, and I think 90% of you told me that you're using the Part 5 definition, but you could use the net amount for IRS if you were using the IRS definition. So I go back to what definition are you using, and then that would help us with the amount. Oh, it's received monthly. Okay, here. Okay. Okay. The cost of gas. Okay. All right. So then somebody asked another question about foster children. We'll go back to that in a second. In gas royalties, the gross is total amount well produced. Then the driller takes all their fees. The gross could be $2,500, and after the property owner gets their share, that person may only get $25. Oh, so that's the net amount. Oh, okay, got it. And you're using Part 5. Then it's what they actually receive. I would just go with what they actually received and maybe not get tripped up on the word gross or the word net, but definitely send a note into DCED, and then they can help get an answer. But I think off the cuff, I think you would include just what they actually receive. Oh, and it changes all the time. Oh, well, okay. So this doesn't make our jobs any easier, right? If it changes over time, can't the well be more consistent? Okay. So sometimes this is not easy. So thanks for that. What an interesting thing. Not something that I have seen in my time with income eligibility. So thanks for that. Okay. All right. I think we have an answer. Hopefully you're good. Write us back if you're not. And then foster children. So foster children for income eligibility, so gross annual income, foster children, they're not counted as household members, and any payments received for their care is not included in gross annual income. Okay? Now my dog's making an appearance. So hopefully that helps. Okay, so you would want to make sure that you are excluding them. So foster care payments are not included, and the foster children are not either. Okay, all right. Other questions? What else do we see? I think that's it. Are you folks seeing anything else in the queue?
I am not.
Okay. Okay, great. Well, if there's anything that you want us to cover, if you've got questions, we are going to provide DCED, like I mentioned, with the updated TA manual, and then also recordings. So if you happen to have missed a session, they will have the recordings that will be made available. Hopefully that's helpful. How do we get on your mailing list is in the chat box. I probably think that that's a question for DCED, since I covered the HUD Exchange mailing list. So is there a way for them to get on your mailing list at DCED?
Absolutely. They can email their grant manager or the program manager for whichever program it is. If it's multiple programs, they can probably just ask, their one of their grant managers, and they can be added. And they should indicate which programs that they would like to have to receive the documentation for, whether it's CDBG, home, or ESG, or all of them.
Okay, great. Thanks. So one thing you could also do is that if you have any feedback about the webinar series, you could certainly provide it in the chat box to DCED or email your point of contact at DCED. Want to make sure that we, meet your expectations, that we improve. I'm sure there are things that we could have done differently. As you know, we had the changes from in-person to online. But we do appreciate all of the questions and the engaging conversation. I've learned so much more about Pennsylvania the last couple of weeks. Anything else? If there's no more questions, or if you don't want me to do anything else, Kimberly, Donna, any parting words?
I would just like to thank everybody who attended all of our sessions. Encourage that if there's still any outstanding questions or concerns, or you need any type of guidance, to email your assigned grant manager, and we will be happy at DCED to follow up individually. And just wish everybody a safe and happy, wonderful holiday coming up, the 4th of July. And Shauna and Chantel, you did a fabulous job. Thank you.
Thank you. It was our pleasure and lots of fun. So,
Kimberly, this is Shauna. I just want to reiterate what Shauna said, is that you know, DCED did have to redirect. We were to have these sessions in person. So anything that we can do differently to meet your expectations, please do let us know, because at this point in our work lives, this is the training that's going to be done. It will be done virtually, so we do need your feedback. And breaking this one up was very important because there was a lot of information to review with everyone, and we hope we got it right by parceling out in topic-wise and then following up with these office hours. So just wanted to reiterate that point. Thank you.
Okay, great. So still chat with us. We'll still, you know, keep this up for about another 5 minutes. So chat with us and tell us what worked, what could be better, anything like that, and certainly fill out the Mentimeter, which I have showing on my screen, and hopefully you have on your computer or on your smartphone. So please let us know. And thanks, everyone. And as folks have said, stay safe. And I can't wait to come back to Pennsylvania in person. All right, take care.